It struck me that the part of one part of the constitutional change which is very revolutionary is this spelling out of the rights to things like housing, water, free education, free health service, the right to join a labour union, the right to food security, because actually putting these in the constitution does emphasise how important they are, and it reflects the reality that I recall when I interviewed the then finance minister. He said many times how the priority in setting the national budget was reducing poverty, and it's now really written firmly into the constitution and is the fundamental task of government. And I think it's very important and something that simply wouldn't be recognised in Europe, in the United States, as a fundamental task of government. And it shows how revolutionary obviously the government is, but now reflected in the constitution itself. And as you said, Becca, it makes that more difficult to change if the government were to change in the future.
So what about this co-presidency, which strikes me as one of the, and one of the things that stands out is, and I think it's unprecedented. I can't think of any other country in the world that whose constitution says that the presidency must be shared between a man and a woman, and they have the right to name vice presidents for particular purposes. Am I correct in that?
I don't think there's another country that mandates that a woman share power at the top of the country with a man. In fact, there's not very many countries that actually have a 50-50 law like Nicaragua does. So Nicaragua, I see the co-presidency actually as being very consistent with recent laws that were made in Nicaragua that have been passed to mandate that 50% of all candidates be women. At other levels of government, when you have a female mayor, you have to have a male deputy mayor, for example, and vice versa. So there has to be that 50-50 power sharing between men and women all throughout government. And in fact, we've seen that at all levels. The student organizations in the secondary schools, they now in classrooms, you don't have a class president, you have two class presidents. You have a male and a female class president. So I think that's something that has changed culturally, even in the country. And this co-presidency is kind of a natural extension of that, to reflect what Nicaragua's been doing very successfully. And I actually have to say I'm very proud about that. And I think this is something that should be brought up as being very positive, because this Constitution guarantees the rights of women. The rights of women were already guaranteed in the Constitution that was written in 1987, but this Constitution spells it out in such a way that it's actually quite surprising, the language that's used. The one of the articles, I'll just read a section of it because it says, "We women in Nicaragua are the protagonists of our own lives, and we exercise our rights and equality through capability and effective presence in all spaces, events, and moments in our history. We women are forgers and direct and active participants throughout our history." And I don't know of any other constitution that uses the first person language to speak about women. I think that's quite revolutionary in and of itself. So I think that there's a lot to be said for this. And as I said, it's kind of an extension of this 50-50 throughout, and brings it right up to the highest powers, which is very important to have that at a country that has co-presidents. I've never heard of that, and especially to have 50% mandated as female at the top of the country.
I think that's really important, Becca, and I think it's, as you said, it reflects reality as well, that if you look around the country, you see women in leading positions all over the place, in a way that you wouldn't do anywhere else, I don't think. And so the Constitution, in a way, is kind of catching up with reality, as it's been over the last decade or so. I want you to go into a little bit more detail on this sovereignty question, because it struck me that both in the Constitution and in the other legislative changes that the government are making at the moment, there's quite a lot there about protecting sovereignty. First, there's the requirement that banks and other institutions can't implement foreign sanctions being imposed on the country, which I think is very important. It's symbolic in a way because most of these sanctions apply in the country where they're created. The United States, for example, you can't, if you're sanctioned as an individual, you can't fly there and you can't have a bank account there, although that's for most Nicaraguans is not particularly important. But I think it's very important that Nicaraguan institutions shouldn't implement those sanctions on behalf of the US or any other country, and that's now established. So it's part of a sort of general pattern of limiting or removing foreign interference in the country, which I think runs through several of the changes. It's about strengthening or defining properly and strengthening the borders and how people can't cross the borders with treasonous intentions, like happened in 2018. It's about strengthening the use of the Cordoba as opposed to the dollar in transactions within the country, which is also important. It restates, I think, what happened before, which was that there's no extradition provisions in Nicaraguan law. So people who are criminals have to be tried in Nicaragua. They can't, as they could be in, or can be still in Honduras, I think, extradited to the United States. So I think that's recently been changed. There's a provision about media control by foreign bodies, which is very important because of the way that local media were controlled by US-funded organisations in the run-up to 2018. And there's a restatement, I think, of something that was in there before, but is, worth restating, which is that there shouldn't be any foreign military bases in Nicaragua, because there are foreign military bases in El Salvador, Honduras, Costa Rica, and Panama, all of the adjoining countries, and they're not welcome here. So I think that sort of collection of and that's not all of it, but those are some examples of how the changes both in the constitution and other legislation which is going through at the same time are strengthening Nicaraguan sovereignty in response to the threats that it still faces, but face particularly from 2018 onwards.
Yeah, another thing in the constitution that we might mention is there are a couple of things that I think certainly struck me. One is that the preamble now makes very, very strong and explicit mention of particular individuals in Nicaragua's history. And also it mentions the importance of Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines, the heroes of Haitian independence, which I thought was tremendously innovative. And that has to do with the other point that certainly struck me, and Waldrak Jański commented on this, the way that the Constitution reflects Nicaragua's, in terms of foreign policy, Nicaragua's commitment to peace, Nicaragua's commitment to international solidarity with peoples that are still facing very serious aggression by the imperialist powers. And I thought that was tremendously important, and that what that means in effect is that the constitutional reforms strongly reinforce the existing emphasis in Nicaraguan's foreign policy on solidarity, for example, with Palestine, and with countries facing aggression, for example, Iran and Syria. And well, without getting into too much controversy, let's leave it at that. But it just seems to me that too is an important point to bear in mind in terms of what the constitutional reforms mean in terms of future government policy.
It's also significant that there's a point in there about non-interference in other countries' affairs. So there's this, on the one side, you've got this declaration of solidarity with oppressed peoples, as in Palestine, etc. And on the other, you've got this statement that Nicaragua doesn't believe in interfering in other countries' affairs. And I think that's particularly important because, for example, we've seen questionable elections, perhaps for example, in Honduras or Guatemala. And Nicaragua's never commented on those elections because it believes that those are issues which should be dealt with by Hondurans or Guatemalans, and it wants the same to apply to Nicaragua. And this it's a statement against this sort of selective interference on the part of the Western powers in countries like Nicaragua, or Venezuela, Cuba, where they're happy to decry lack of democracy and ignore the same in other countries. Nicaragua was putting its statement down, really saying we won't be judging other countries in that respect, and we don't expect to be judged in that way ourselves.
I think it's a reflection of Nicaragua's consistency in foreign policy. Nicaragua is always extremely consistent in following rule of law, international law, and respect for other countries and their sovereignty and everything that it does. And that's reflected in this constitution, these constitutional amendments as well. I think it's also very interesting that Nicaragua mentions, and that in this constitution now is mentioned a multipolar world. Maybe we'll be the first constitution in the world to have mentioned that particular phrase in our constitution. And then also, I think it's very important that Nicaragua mentions there the sentence from The Hague in favor of Nicaragua from 1987. And that is something that is now in the Constitution. So we're kind of reiterating Nicaragua has the right to do what's needed to ensure the payment of those reparations that the United States still owes Nicaragua.
And it makes the point too.
Sorry?
Sorry, Stephen. It makes the point too that about peaceful resolution of disputes. So you mentioned the going to The Hague, Becca, but it also mentions in the Constitution the peaceful resolution of border disputes with Colombia and Costa Rica. And I think, Nicaragua has been very consistent in that, in saying that it wants to resolve disputes through peaceful means. And really now that's embodied in the Constitution, and that's very important too.
Yeah, I think in relation to that, it's worth noting that, unless I'm mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the Constitution brings up to date Nicaragua's borders, territorial borders, to incorporate the 2012 judgment in relation to its maritime territory that had been usurped by Colombia for 50, 60 years. So, yeah, and is there anything else? Something that also might be worth mentioning is that the Constitution makes much clearer, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, sorry, the truck. It makes much clearer the position of the army and the police. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, I think it does. There's numbers of changes made to the statutes about the military and police that I think come from lessons learned in recent years, and those include being able to have a volunteer police force and volunteer military as well.
One aspect we haven't touched on, Stephen, is personal rights. And I thought it was interesting that the Constitution now has a personal right to information held by the state on you. And also it's got clauses about non-discrimination and personal liberty. And Becca, I thought you might be interested in commenting on the religious aspects, because you've commented about religion in the past, and I thought those were interesting because there's both statements about religious freedom and the non-laicity of the state, but also issues about no foreign control over religious institutions. And I'd be interested in getting your perspective on those points.
Yeah, I think that, we have to remember Nicaragua is a country where for 500 years, the Catholic Church has basically been part of the state. And so, when the Constitution was written in 1987, it never said there was separation of church and state. That was never mentioned in the Constitution. It said there's no official religion of the country, but that's all it mentioned in terms of religion. These new amendments say very clearly separation of church and state for the first time ever. It also says there's freedom of religion. And it also very interestingly says that no one can hide behind religion to threaten public order. And this has to do very much with recent experiences with hierarchy or priests, at least within the Catholic Church, who have been, in fact, maneuvering to try to overthrow the government and participating in the coup and undemocratic processes. And so, basically, this is stating very clearly that it's against the Constitution for folks to do that, for anyone who's hiding behind the public church. So even if you're a priest, even if you're part of the church hierarchy, you're not going to be able to do that sort of a thing. And this is very important because it also mentions here that religious organizations cannot be under foreign control. So this is very interesting because we all know the Vatican is actually a foreign country, and the Vatican's representatives have been recognized as diplomats and so forth for many, many years. It was actually basically impossible for the Nicaraguan state to prosecute someone who was part of the Catholic Church. And now that has changed. If a priest commits a crime, they can be prosecuted in the country. But this is something that has been very difficult, sort of surprisingly difficult to change, I think. And so these aspects are being put into the Constitution to make it very clear that even if you're part of the Catholic Church or any other religious body, you're not allowed to participate in coups and violate the Constitution.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm right at the start of the Constitution. I think it actually is very clear, stating that anybody who violates the Nicaragua's sovereignty and acts in a way that puts in jeopardy Nicaragua's sovereignty is basically guilty of high treason. And lose their nationality, and that's very explicit now, and I perhaps it wasn't before. I might be wrong about that, but yeah, and I think that goes back to what John was saying right at the beginning about the defense of sovereignty. And the other thing that might be, if we have time, I'm a bit pressed for time. But if we have time, it might be worth looking at the umbrella clause that forbids discrimination of any kind. Do you think that's an adequate protection for example, for people in terms of sexual diversity? And there seems to be a very explicit commitment in the constitutional reforms to protecting and encouraging diversity of all kinds.
I would agree.
Yes,
go ahead, John. Go ahead.
Sorry, to me that reflected the reality, despite criticisms that are made by opposition spokespeople of Nicaragua, not tolerating lesbian and gay people, for example. In reality, especially in Masaya, where I live, there's a high degree of tolerance and acceptance, and people can express themselves with complete freedom in this respect, as far as I can see. And I think that the fact that this respect for individual freedom in those respects, although it's not spelt out in terms of people who are lesbian or gay or whatever, I think that the general clause in the Constitution, which respects individual liberty, does recognise that there aren't any restrictions in that respect, and that's very important.
I would agree. I think that the language of the Constitution overall is very inclusive. It's been, updated and modernized, but it's actually become much more inclusive. And I think that there's a very deliberate attempt to not exclude anyone from this Constitution. I think that it would be too much to hope for, given the strong elements of right-wing, sort of conservative Christianity in Nicaragua. I think it would be too much to hope that we could have spelled out sexual diversity rights for LGBTQ people or trans people or whatever. But I do think that it's very careful. In many places, they talk about, all over it talks about person, family, and community as being the entities that are the protagonists within Nicaraguan society, and inclusivity in incorporating the individual, the family, and the community in everything that's done. And very carefully, the family is mentioned many times as made up of men and women. It is not mentioned being made up of a man and a woman. The section on marriage does mention a man and a woman, but it doesn't exclusively mention man and a woman. So I think that we're obviously not going to get gay marriage approved in Nicaragua in the current religious, mood, but I do think that it leaves things very clear that no one is to be discriminated against for any reason, and that's extremely clear. And then, of course, there are other laws and regulations that come off of the Constitution that support that more. So there are very clear rules. There's many of the Nicaraguan institutions, including the Ministry of Health, have regulations that say, for example, you must use the name of a preferred name of the person, of your patient. You can't, if your patient identifies as a woman instead of a man and says that my name is X, then that's the name you have to call them by. And there are, those are enforceable rules. You can be fired for not following them. So I think there's very strong legislation, and there's also very strong sort of administrative rules that protect people. But it all starts in the Constitution, and the Constitution very clearly and I think very deliberately is inclusive and says that there are equal rights for everybody.
Yeah, and I think John's point that there's been associated legislation that, sorry, there's a truck going by. Sorry. I think John's point that there's a great deal of associated legislation that reinforces many of the points that we've been discussing in relation to the constitutional reforms. Please excuse me, Becca and John, I have to go. I have commitments that I can't let go. So I'll leave the meeting, but do by all means go on without me. And thank you very, very much for agreeing to discuss this matter so that in such a helpful way, so that people interested in Nicaragua and in the Solidarity Coalition for Nicaragua have a better idea of what's going on with regard to these constitutional reforms. Thank you very much, and bye-bye. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Stephen. Bye.